When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, but not from fear of being caught. It was because he would see those messages. The ones I forgot to delete. I tried to snatch the phone from his hands, but he skillfully pulled it back and kept reading. I watched his face change as he read line after line, feeling my life crumble in mere seconds. Yes, now he would learn the truth. But not the whole truth. His hands trembled as he scrolled further, and I knew, right now he would reach that message, the one that would destroy my life. The only one that would explain everything and put a final period. Or maybe confuse him even more. My phone suddenly vibrated in his hands, and a new notification appeared on the screen. I saw his face turn pale as he read the sender's name. My husband froze. Didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit when I'm nervous. My nerves mixed with the horror of realizing what I had done. His breathing quickened. I could hear it even from the 6 feet separating us. This was exactly what I feared most. Because 3 months ago I made a mistake, that mistake that changed absolutely everything forever, and now. I didn't know what to do, but let me tell you how it really was. Before I share with you the secret I tried so carefully to hide for so long, write in the comments what city you're watching this video from, and also answer this question: have you ever had a secret that you tried to hide with all your might, but in the end, you couldn't keep it hidden? 8 years of marriage had turned my life into a perfectly choreographed dance of mundane routines. Every morning, I would wake up at 6:30, brew coffee in the same ceramic pot my mother-in-law gave us as a wedding gift, and set out 2 matching cups on the granite counter. Richard would emerge from his study, yes, he slept there now, claiming his back needed the firmer couch, grab his coffee, scan his phone, and disappear into the shower without a single word. I used to try. God knows I tried. How did you sleep? I'd ask, arranging the morning pills he needed for his blood pressure next to his cup. Fine, would come the response, delivered with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. Any plans for today? I'd persist, desperate to crack through the invisible wall that had somehow built itself between us. The usual, he'd say, already heading upstairs. The usual. Everything in our life had become the usual. The usual breakfast of whole grain toast with organic almond butter. The usual kiss on the cheek, more like a brush of lips against skin, before he left for his consulting firm downtown. The usual 8 hours I'd spend alone in our suburban fortress, cleaning rooms that were already clean, organizing closets that were already organized, and pretending that the silence didn't make me want to scream. I wasn't always like this. There was a time when I painted watercolors, when I read 3 books a week, when I had opinions about art and politics and the future. But somewhere between learning to cook Richard's mother's pot roast recipe and accepting that my dreams of becoming an art historian were impractical, I had become a ghost haunting my own life. The house reflected our marriage perfectly, beautiful, expensive, and completely sterile. Richard had chosen every piece of furniture from a catalog, prioritizing durability over warmth. Our living room looked like a showroom, cream-colored sectional, glass coffee table, abstract paintings that matched the curtains but said nothing at all. Even our bedroom had become a monument to polite distance, 2 nightstands, 2 separate reading lamps, 2 sides of the bed that might as well have been different continents. I remember standing in our walk-in closet that morning, staring at my reflection in the full-length mirror. 47 years old, still attractive enough to turn heads at the grocery store, still fit from my daily yoga sessions, still the woman Richard had married. But when I looked into my own eyes, I saw someone I barely recognized. When had I stopped wearing red lipstick? When had I started choosing clothes for their appropriateness rather than how they made me feel? The sound of Richard's car pulling out of the driveway was both a relief and a sentence. Another day stretched ahead of me, empty as a blank canvas. I had volunteered at the local library on Tuesdays, took a pottery class on Thursdays, and had coffee with my sister Margaret on Fridays, but these activities felt like band-aids on a wound that kept growing larger. I was rinsing our breakfast dishes when I heard it, the rumble of a moving truck pulling into the driveway next door. The Henderson house had been empty for 3 months since old Mrs. Henderson moved to assisted living. I found myself gravitating toward the kitchen window, wiping my hands on a dish towel as I watched the movers carry box after box into the colonial-style home that mirrored ours. Then I saw him. He emerged from a beat-up pickup truck that looked wildly out of place in our neighborhood of luxury vehicles. Tall, maybe 6'2", with dark hair that needed a cut and clothes that suggested he dressed for comfort rather than impression. He moved with an easy confidence that struck me immediately, the way he gestured to the movers, the way he ran his hand through his hair while surveying his new domain. Even from a distance, I could see he was different from our usual neighbors. No pressed khakis, no polo shirt, no golf shoes. Instead, he wore faded jeans with paint stains and a gray t-shirt that had seen better days. He looked like someone who worked with his hands, who understood that life was meant to be lived rather than curated. I realized I had been standing at the window for 10 minutes, dish towel still in my hands, watching this stranger direct his life into the space next door. Something about his presence had broken through my morning stupor, had made me aware of my own heartbeat in a way I hadn't felt in years. When he suddenly turned toward my house, I stepped back from the window quickly, embarrassed to be caught staring. But not before our eyes met for just a moment. He raised his hand in a friendly wave, and I found myself waving back automatically, feeling heat rise to my cheeks like a teenager. Who was this man, and why did his simple presence make me feel more alive than I had in months? 3 days passed before I saw him again, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't looking. Each morning, as I went through my coffee ritual, my eyes would drift to the house next door. His pickup truck would be gone by 8, returning around 6 with what looked like art supplies or canvas frames tied in the back. An artist. That explained everything and nothing at all. On Thursday morning, I decided to take a long bath instead of my usual quick shower. Richard had left early for a client meeting in Hartford, and the house felt particularly empty. I filled our oversized garden tub with lavender bath salts, lit the vanilla candles that had been gathering dust on the bathroom counter, and sank into the warm water with a novel I'd been meaning to read for months. The bathroom had always been my sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out onto our private backyard, and the morning light filtered through sheer curtains, creating patterns on the marble floor. It was the one room in the house where I allowed myself to think freely, where the silence felt peaceful rather than oppressive. I was just reaching for my book when I heard the doorbell ring. Then again. Then a third time, followed by knocking. Whoever it was seemed determined. I glanced at the clock, 9:15. Too early for deliveries, too late for emergencies. I wrapped myself in my white terry cloth robe and padded downstairs, hair still damp from the bath. Through the peephole, I could see him, the new neighbor, holding an enormous bouquet of mixed flowers. Roses, lilies, baby's breath, arranged with an artistry that suggested he knew something about beauty. My heart did something strange, a flutter that reminded me I was very much alive underneath all that suburban numbness. I opened the door, acutely aware that I was wearing nothing but a bathrobe, that my hair was messy, that I probably looked nothing like the polished suburban wife he'd expect. "Hi," he said, and his voice was warm, slightly rough around the edges. "I'm looking for Mrs. Patterson." I wanted to introduce myself and thank her for the welcome note. I stared at him, confused. "I'm sorry, but there's no Mrs. Patterson here. This is the Morrison house." His face flushed red. "Oh God, I am so sorry." I thought, the house numbers. He looked around, clearly flustered. "I'm an idiot. Wrong house entirely. I should have pointed him in the right direction. Should have closed the door and returned to my bath. Instead, I found myself saying, "Mrs. Patterson lives 3 houses down, the blue one with the rose garden. But those flowers are beautiful. Thank you. I picked them myself, I arranged them. There's a flower farm about 20 minutes out of town." He paused, studying my face. "I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name." "Savannah," I said, the word feeling strange on my lips. When was the last time someone had asked my name? When was the last time I'd introduced myself as anything other than Richard's wife? "I'm David. David Chen. I just moved in next door." He gestured toward his house with the hand not holding flowers. "I was hoping to meet the neighbors, maybe bake some bread or something normal like that, but I burn everything I touch in the kitchen." I laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in weeks. Bread might be ambitious for a first impression. Exactly what my sister said. Hence the flowers instead. He paused, looking down at the elaborate bouquet. "You know what? These were meant to be a thank you anyway. Would you like them? As an apology for disturbing your morning?" Everything in my rational mind said to politely decline. To thank him, direct him to Mrs. Patterson, and close the door on this unexpected interruption to my carefully controlled day. Instead, I heard myself saying, "They're lovely. Thank you." He handed me the bouquet, and when our fingers brushed against each other, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed, a spark of electricity, a reminder that I was a woman, not just a wife going through the motions. The flowers smelled like summer, like possibility, like everything my life used to be. "I should let you get back to your day," he said, but neither of us moved. "I was just taking a bath," I said, then immediately felt my cheeks burn. Too much information. Too intimate a detail to share with a stranger. "The best kind of morning," he said easily, without any awkwardness. "I'm a firm believer in long baths. Life's too short for 5-minute showers." We kissed. I'm not sure who moved first, or how it happened so naturally, but suddenly his lips were on mine and I was kissing him back with 8 years of suppressed longing. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, maybe 30. Time seemed to stop and rush forward simultaneously. The sound of Richard's car in the driveway shattered the moment like breaking glass. David stepped back immediately, his eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been regret. Or maybe that was just my own face reflected in his gaze. "I should go," he whispered, already backing toward the side yard. "Yes," I whispered back, clutching the flowers to my chest like armor. He disappeared around the corner just as Richard's key turned in the front door. I stood there, heart pounding, lips still tingling, holding a bouquet that smelled like betrayal and felt like awakening. "You're up early," Richard said, barely glancing at me as he headed to the kitchen. "Forgot my presentation folder." "Just getting some fresh air," I managed, grateful he hadn't noticed the flowers, or my flushed cheeks, or the fact that my entire world had just shifted on its axis. The flowers sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days, growing more beautiful as they opened fully, filling the room with a sweetness that made Richard wrinkle his nose every time he passed them. "Did Margaret bring those?" he asked on Friday morning, not really waiting for an answer as he gathered his briefcase and gym bag. "Yes," I lied smoothly, the word sliding out before I could stop it. "She picked them up at that farmer's market she loves." It was such a small deception, but it felt enormous. I caught myself checking my reflection every time I passed a mirror, as if the lie might be written across my face in lipstick. But Richard didn't seem to notice anything different about me, didn't see that I was wearing the red blouse I'd bought 2 years ago and never worn, didn't comment on the fact that I'd actually styled my hair instead of pulling it back in its usual ponytail. I found myself timing my grocery trips differently, choosing the small market on Elm Street instead of the large supermarket where I usually shopped. It was completely irrational. David probably had his own routines, his own preferred stores. But on Tuesday morning, as I was selecting avocados that I didn't really need, I heard that familiar voice behind me. The ones on the bottom are usually riper. I turned around, my heart doing that same strange flutter. He was holding a basket filled with ingredients that looked exotic compared to my usual purchases: fresh ginger, lemongrass, something green and leafy I couldn't identify. "You're quite the cook," I said, nodding toward his basket. "I'm learning. Part of my fresh start philosophy." He smiled, and I noticed he had a small scar above his left eyebrow. "New house, new recipes, new life. Fresh start," I repeated. "That sounds wonderful. What about you? Any fresh starts in your future?" The question hung between us, loaded with meaning I wasn't sure I was ready to unpack. I thought about my morning routine, my afternoon pottery class, my weekly coffee with Margaret where we discussed the same topics we'd been discussing for 5 years. "I'm not sure I remember how to start fresh," I admitted. "It's easier than you think. You just do one thing differently. Buy a different kind of coffee. Take a different route home. Talk to a neighbor you've never met before." His eyes held mine. "Kiss someone who brings you flowers." My cheeks burned. "About that. No apology necessary," he said quickly. "Some moments just happen." But that was the problem, wasn't it? Moments like that didn't just happen to women like me. Women with 8-year marriages and mortgage payments and carefully planned retirement accounts. Women who said the right things at neighborhood barbecues and never forgot to send thank you notes. "I should go," I said, even though I didn't want to leave. "Of course. But Savannah?" He waited until I looked at him again. "The art center downtown is having an exhibit opening Friday night. Local artists. I have a piece in it, nothing fancy, just a small painting. If you're interested in fresh starts, it might be worth seeing." He handed me a flyer from his jacket pocket, the paper still warm from his body heat. The image showed a watercolor landscape, all soft blues and greens that reminded me of the paintings I used to love. "I'll think about it," I said, knowing I was lying, knowing I would definitely be there. That afternoon, I sat in my pottery class, my hands covered in clay, trying to center a piece that kept wobbling on the wheel. Mrs. Chen, no relation to David, she'd been my instructor for 2 years, watched me struggle with the same patience she'd shown since my first class. "You're fighting it today," she observed. "Clay responds to your energy. If you're agitated, it knows." I was agitated. The conversation with David had unsettled something in me, had made me aware of how small my world had become. When was the last time I'd gone to an art opening? When was the last time I'd stayed out past 9 o'clock without Richard? "Try breathing into your hands," Mrs. Chin suggested. "Let your energy flow down through your fingers." I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, trying to quiet the voice in my head that kept repeating David's words, "Some moments just happen." When I opened my eyes, the clay had suddenly yielded, rising into a perfect cylinder under my palms. "Better," Mrs. Chen said with approval. "When you stop trying to control everything, beautiful things can emerge." That evening, I found myself standing in front of my closet, holding the flyer David had given me. Richard was at his weekly poker game, wouldn't be home until after midnight. I could go to the opening, spend an hour looking at art, come home before he returned. No one would know. But I would know. I put the flyer on my nightstand and chose a book instead, settling into the reading chair by the window. But I couldn't concentrate on the words. My eyes kept drifting to the house next door, where warm light glowed in what must be David's studio. I could see shadows moving behind the sheer curtains, the suggestion of someone at work, creating something beautiful. Around 11, I saw him come outside to his small back deck with a cup of tea. He sat in an old wooden chair, looking up at the stars, completely still. There was something peaceful about his posture, something that suggested he was comfortable with solitude in a way I'd never learned to be. I turned off my light and watched him for a few more minutes, this man who had somehow made me remember that I was more than just Richard's wife, more than just a woman going through the motions of a life that felt increasingly like a performance. When he finally went inside, I picked up the flyer again, running my finger over the image of his painting. Friday was 3 days away. 3 days to decide whether I was brave enough to take the first step toward whatever fresh start might be waiting for me. Friday arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of October weather that made me want to stay inside with tea and a book. Richard had mentioned working late again, a pattern that had become so normal I'd stopped asking why. He left that morning with barely a goodbye, and I spent the day moving restlessly through the house, cleaning things that didn't need cleaning, reorganizing drawers that were already perfectly organized. By 4 o'clock, I'd changed clothes 3 times. The first outfit, a navy dress I wore to church, felt too formal. The second, jeans and a sweater, seemed too casual. I finally settled on black slacks and a burgundy silk blouse that Margaret had helped me pick out last spring, something that felt like me but also like the person I was trying to remember how to be. The art center occupied a converted warehouse in the historic district downtown, a part of the city I rarely visited anymore. I'd driven past it hundreds of times but never thought to stop. The parking lot was fuller than I'd expected, and I sat in my car for 5 minutes, engine running, wondering if I was making a terrible mistake. But when I walked through the glass doors, the warmth and energy hit me immediately. People clustered around paintings hung on white brick walls, wine glasses in hand, voices animated with the kind of conversations I hadn't had in years. The smell of paint and coffee mixed with something floral, maybe the eucalyptus arrangements on the reception table. Savannah? I turned to find David approaching, and my breath caught. He'd traded his usual paint-stained clothes for dark jeans and a white button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that showed evidence of physical work. His hair was still slightly unruly, but it suited him. "You came," he said, and the warmth in his voice made my stomach flutter. "I told you I'd think about it," I said, accepting the glass of wine he offered. "Which one is yours?" He led me across the room to a small watercolor that took my breath away. It showed a woman sitting by a window, morning light streaming across her face as she looked out at a garden. But it wasn't the technical skill that struck me, it was the emotion captured in those brushstrokes, the sense of longing and possibility that seemed to radiate from the canvas. "She looks like she's waiting for something," I said softly. "Or someone," David replied. "I painted it a few weeks after I moved here. Something about the light in this town inspired me." I studied the painting more closely and felt a strange recognition, as if I were looking at myself from the outside. The woman's posture, the way her hand rested on the windowsill, the expression of quiet yearning, it was uncomfortably familiar. "It's beautiful," I said finally. "Do you always paint women?" "I paint what moves me," he said simply. "Lately, that's been the idea of transformation. People on the verge of becoming who they're meant to be." We moved through the gallery together, and I found myself seeing art through his eyes. He pointed out techniques I'd never noticed, explained how certain colors created emotional responses, shared stories about the other artists whose work surrounded us. It was the kind of conversation I'd craved for years, intelligent, passionate, real. "You know a lot about art," he observed as we paused in front of an abstract piece that seemed to pulse with energy. "I used to study it," I admitted. "Art history." I had plans to work in a museum, maybe curate exhibitions. "What happened?" The question was gentle, but it still hit me like a physical blow. What had happened? Marriage, I supposed. Richard's career taking priority. The gradual understanding that my dreams were impractical, that security mattered more than passion. "Life," I said simply. Life has a way of detours, David said. But it's never too late to get back on the original path. We were standing close enough that I could smell his cologne, something clean and woodsy that made me want to lean closer. When he turned to look at me, his eyes were serious. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "And you can tell me it's none of my business." I nodded, though my heart was already racing. "Are you happy?" Such a simple question, but it hit me like a revelation. When was the last time anyone had asked me that? When was the last time I'd asked myself? "I don't think about happiness much anymore," I said honestly. "I think about responsibility. Routine. Making sure everything runs smoothly." "That's not the same thing." "No," I whispered. "It's not." The gallery was beginning to empty, the evening winding down. David walked me to my car, our footsteps echoing in the parking lot. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and cool. "Thank you for tonight," I said when we reached my sedan. It felt good to remember who I used to be. "You're still that person," he said. "She's just been waiting for permission to emerge." We stood facing each other in the dim light from the street lamp, and I knew we were at another crossroads. I could get in my car, drive home, return to my careful life of routines and responsibilities. Or I could take another step toward whatever this was becoming. We kissed. This time it was different, slower, more intentional. His hand cupped my face gently, and I felt something inside me crack open, some wall I'd built around my heart beginning to crumble. When we finally separated, I was breathing hard, and the world looked different somehow, sharper and more vivid. "I should go," I whispered, though I made no move toward my car. "Should is a dangerous word," he said softly. "It keeps us from everything we actually want." I drove home in a daze, my lips still tingling, my mind spinning with possibilities I'd never allowed myself to consider. Richard's car wasn't in the driveway, still at the office, still lost in his own world of responsibilities and shoulds. Inside, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in the living room, looking around at the perfect furniture, the careful arrangements, the life I'd built that felt suddenly like a beautiful prison. In the distance, I could see light in David's studio window, and I wondered what he was creating now, what emotions he was capturing with his brushes. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard, "Working late again. Don't wait up." I stared at the message for a long time, then typed back, "Okay." But nothing about this felt okay anymore. Everything was changing, and for the first time in years, I wasn't sure if that terrified me or thrilled me. Maybe both. My phone buzzed again 20 minutes later. This time it wasn't Richard. "Thank you for tonight. I hope I didn't overstep." David's message was simple, but reading it made my heart race all over again. I stared at the screen for 10 minutes before typing back, "You didn't." Good. I was hoping we could continue our conversation about art sometime. Maybe over dinner? This was it. The moment where I could step back, make excuses, return to my safe life of routines and careful boundaries. Instead, I found myself typing, "When? Tomorrow?" Richard mentioned at the gallery opening that he's traveling this weekend. My blood turned to ice. "You talked to Richard?" "Briefly. He seemed surprised to see you there. Said he didn't know you were interested in art." I felt nauseous. Richard had been at the gallery? I'd been so focused on David, so lost in our conversation, that I hadn't noticed my own husband in the room. How was that possible? How long had he been watching us? "Are you all right?" David's next message came quickly. "You look pale." I realized he could probably see me through our kitchen windows. The thought should have alarmed me, but instead it felt intimate, as if we were connected by something stronger than the physical distance between our houses. "I'm fine," I lied, then immediately followed with, "What did you tell him?" Nothing. He introduced himself. We made small talk about the neighborhood. He left before I could mention that we'd met. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by shame. I was relieved that my husband didn't know I'd spent the evening with another man. What did that say about my marriage? What did that say about me? Richard's car pulled into the driveway at 1:15 in the morning. I was lying in bed, pretending to sleep, listening to his familiar routine, keys on the kitchen counter, shoes by the front door, the soft whoosh of the refrigerator opening. He moved through the house like a ghost, careful not to disturb anything, including me. When he finally slipped into bed, I could smell the faint scent of cigarettes and wine. Richard didn't smoke, which meant he'd been somewhere social, somewhere he hadn't mentioned. I wanted to roll over, ask him about his evening, tell him about mine. Instead, I lay perfectly still, feeling the space between us like an ocean. Saturday dawned bright and clear, the kind of autumn day that made everything seem possible. Richard left early for his golf game, kissing my forehead absently before gathering his clubs. Back by 6, he said, the same thing he said every Saturday. David's invitation hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was brave enough to cross. I spent the morning gardening, pulling up the last of the summer flowers, preparing the beds for winter. The physical work felt good, grounding, but my eyes kept drifting to his house. At 3 o'clock, he appeared in his backyard with a cup of coffee and a sketchpad. He waved when he saw me, and I waved back, my heart doing that familiar flutter. When he gestured for me to join him, I found myself walking across the small strip of grass that separated our properties. "Beautiful day," he said, patting the wooden deck chair beside him. "Perfect," I agreed, settling into the chair and accepting the cup of tea he offered from a thermos. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the leaves drift down from the old oak that stood between our houses. His presence felt natural, easy in a way that surprised me. When was the last time I'd sat quietly with Richard without feeling the need to fill the silence with chatter? "I've been thinking about what you said," David said eventually. "About it never being too late to get back on your original path. And what conclusion did you reach?" "That maybe the detours are part of the path. Maybe we have to lose ourselves before we can find who we're really meant to be." I thought about that as I watched him sketch the oak tree, his hand moving confidently across the paper. There was something mesmerizing about watching an artist work, seeing the way he translated the world into lines and shadows. "Can I show you something?" he asked suddenly. I followed him into his house, through rooms that were nothing like mine. Where my home was carefully coordinated and controlled, his was lived in and warm. Books stacked on tables, paintings leaning against walls, the smell of coffee and turpentine and something that might have been sandalwood. His studio occupied what should have been the formal dining room. Canvases covered every surface, some finished, others half completed. But it was the painting on the easel that stopped me cold. It was me. Sitting in my garden this morning, sunlight streaming across my face, completely absorbed in pulling weeds. But he'd captured something I'd never seen in myself, a kind of quiet strength, a beauty that had nothing to do with makeup or careful styling. "When did you paint this?" I whispered. "I've been working on it for weeks." "You have this expression when you think no one's watching. Like you're remembering something beautiful." I couldn't speak. No one had ever seen me the way this painting suggested. Not even Richard, who'd known me for 10 years. We spent the night together. The next morning, I woke up in his bed with sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the sound of birds singing outside. For a moment, I felt purely happy, warm and content and alive in a way I'd forgotten was possible. Then reality crashed over me like cold water. Richard would be home soon. I had to get back, had to shower and change and pretend that nothing had happened, that I was still the woman who'd left the house yesterday morning. But as I gathered my clothes from David's bedroom floor, I knew that woman was gone forever. The walk across our backyards felt like crossing continents. Every step carried me further from the woman I'd been for one perfect night and closer to the role I'd have to play for the rest of my life. By the time I reached my kitchen door, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. Richard's car wasn't in the driveway yet, but that only gave me a temporary reprieve. I had maybe an hour before he returned from his golf game, expecting to find his wife waiting with dinner preparations and weekend plans, not a woman whose entire world had shifted overnight. The shower water felt scalding against my skin, as if it could wash away the scent of David's cologne, the memory of his hands in my hair, the way he'd whispered my name like a prayer. But even as I scrubbed with lavender soap and shampooed twice, I could still feel him on my skin, still taste him on my lips. I chose my clothes carefully, a casual sundress Richard had complimented before, nothing that would raise questions. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw a stranger. My face was softer somehow, my eyes brighter. I looked like a woman who'd been thoroughly loved, and the evidence of it terrified me. The house felt different too, as if the very walls had witnessed my transformation. I moved through the familiar rooms like an actress learning her lines, trying to remember how the old Savannah had moved, what she'd cared about, how she'd filled her empty hours. I started dinner, Richard's favorite pot roast, the recipe his mother had taught me during our first year of marriage. The familiar ritual should have grounded me, but instead it felt like putting on a costume that no longer fit. As I peeled carrots and seasoned the meat, I kept thinking about the way David had made scrambled eggs that morning, humming under his breath, completely unself-conscious. When Richard's car finally pulled into the driveway at 6:30, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine, pretending to read a magazine. The sound of his key in the lock made my stomach clench with guilt so powerful I thought I might be sick. "Smells good in here," he said, hanging his golf jacket in the closet. "How was your day?" "Quiet," I managed. "Did some gardening, caught up on reading." He nodded absently, already checking his phone for messages. This was our routine, surface-level questions, surface-level answers, both of us skating carefully over the ice of our marriage without acknowledging how thin it had become. "The Hendersons want us to come for dinner next Friday," he said, scrolling through emails. I told them we'd let them know. The Hendersons. Our neighbors 3 houses down, the ones who'd been married 35 years and still held hands during their evening walks. The ones who probably thought Richard and I had the perfect marriage, just like I'd thought about other couples before I learned how hollow perfect could feel. "That sounds nice," I said, the words tasting like ash. Over dinner, Richard talked about his golf game, a potential new client, plans for refinishing the basement. I nodded and made appropriate responses, but my mind kept drifting to David's studio, to the way he'd looked at me like I was the most fascinating woman in the world. "You seem distracted," Richard observed, cutting his pot roast with mechanical precision. "Just tired," I said quickly. "I didn't sleep well last night." It wasn't entirely a lie. I had slept deeply, peacefully, wrapped in David's arms, but it hadn't been in my own bed, and the memory of it felt like betrayal and revelation in equal measure. After dinner, Richard retreated to his study to work on client proposals, and I was left alone with the dishes and my guilt. I washed each plate carefully, trying to focus on the mundane task instead of the chaos in my head. But when I looked out the kitchen window, I could see lights on in David's studio, and I knew he was painting, probably thinking about me the same way I was thinking about him. My phone buzzed with a text, "Are you okay?" I stared at David's message for a full minute before typing back, "I don't know." "Do you regret it?" Did I? I thought about the way he'd held me, the conversations that had lasted until dawn, the feeling of being truly seen for the first time in years. Then I thought about Richard in the next room, about our mortgage and our carefully planned retirement, about the life I'd built that depended on me being exactly who I'd always been. I don't know that either, I texted back. That's honest. Can I see you tomorrow? I looked toward Richard's study, where the soft glow of his computer screen painted shadows on the wall. Tomorrow was Sunday. We'd go to church, have lunch with my sister, spend the afternoon reading the paper and pretending our silence was comfortable. I can't, I typed, then immediately deleted it. I don't think I should, I wrote instead, but deleted that too. Finally, I simply typed, yes. Sunday morning arrived gray and threatening rain, matching my mood perfectly. Richard was already up when I woke, standing at the bathroom mirror with his electric razor, preparing for another week of routines and responsibilities. We moved around each other like dancers who'd forgotten the steps, polite and careful and utterly disconnected. Margaret called, he said, not looking at me as he knotted his tie. She wants to cancel lunch today. Something about helping Jennifer move. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by guilt for feeling relieved. Margaret was my sister, my closest friend, and the thought of sitting across from her today, pretending everything was normal, had filled me with dread. That's fine, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. Maybe we can reschedule for next week. Richard nodded, already mentally moving on to other things. I'll probably spend the afternoon at the office then. Johnson wants the Morrison proposal revised by Monday. Another Sunday alone. 6 months ago, the prospect would have depressed me. Now it felt like a gift I didn't deserve. After Richard left for church, I'd begged off with a headache that wasn't entirely fabricated. I found myself standing at the kitchen window again, watching David's house like a teenager with a crush. The rational part of my mind knew I should stay inside, clean house, read a book, do anything except what I was contemplating. Instead, I found myself walking across the yard in my bare feet, wearing nothing but a robe and the knowledge that I was making a terrible mistake. David answered his door before I could knock, as if he'd been watching for me too. His hair was messy from sleep, and he was wearing faded jeans and nothing else, and the sight of him made my mouth go dry. I keep making terrible decisions, I said by way of greeting. Only terrible if you regret them, he replied, stepping aside to let me in. His house smelled like coffee and paint and something indefinably masculine that made me want to bury my face in his neck and forget about everything else. We stood in his living room, 2 feet apart, the weight of yesterday's intimacy hanging between us like a secret. I don't know how to do this, I admitted. I'm not the kind of person who. There's no rulebook, he said gently. We don't have to define anything. We don't have to make decisions about forever right now. But that was the problem, wasn't it? My entire life had been built on definitions, on careful planning and predictable outcomes. I didn't know how to exist in the undefined space between right and wrong, between love and betrayal. Show me more of your paintings, I said, because looking at his art felt safer than looking at him. He led me through his house, and I realized that every room was a studio of sorts. Paintings leaned against walls, sketchbooks lay open on tables, brushes soaked in jars of turpentine. It was chaos compared to my perfectly organized home, but it was alive in a way my house had never been. This one's new, he said, stopping in front of a canvas I hadn't noticed before. It showed a woman standing at a crossroads, literally, 2 paths diverging in a wooded area. But it was the woman's posture that caught my attention, the way she stood frozen between choices, her face a study in conflict and longing. She looks terrified, I observed. Or exhilarated. Sometimes they're the same thing. I thought about that as we spent the afternoon together, talking about everything and nothing, carefully avoiding the subject of what we were doing and what it meant. When evening approached and I knew Richard would be home soon, David walked me to the edge of his property. Same time next week, he asked, and the question felt loaded with implications I wasn't ready to examine. I don't know, I said honestly. This is so complicated. The best things usually are. That night, I lay in bed next to my husband, listening to his steady breathing and thinking about crossroads and terrible decisions and the way David looked at me like I was worth looking at. Richard reached for me in his sleep, his arm settling across my waist with the casual ownership of 8 years of marriage, and I felt like the worst person in the world. But I also felt more alive than I had in years, and that contradiction was going to destroy me. The following week passed in a haze of guilt and anticipation. Every morning, I watched David leave for what I assumed was his job, something in graphic design, he'd mentioned, and every evening I watched him return. We didn't speak, didn't text, but there was an awareness between us that felt almost physical, like an invisible thread connecting our houses. Richard was distracted with a big client presentation, staying later at the office each night, leaving earlier each morning. Our conversations became even more perfunctory than usual, reduced to logistics about dry cleaning and dinner plans and who would take the car in for service. "You seem different lately," Margaret said over coffee on Thursday. We were sitting in our usual spot at the cafe downtown, but instead of our normal comfortable chatter, I found myself struggling to focus on her words. "Different how?" I asked, stirring cream into my latte with unnecessary concentration. "I don't know. Lighter, maybe?" "You're glowing." She studied my face with the intensity of someone who'd known me for 40 years. "Are you pregnant?" I nearly choked on my coffee. "God, no. I'm 47, Margaret. Stranger things have happened. Remember Susan Carmichael?" I deflected with questions about her daughters, her job at the library, anything to avoid her too perceptive gaze. But as I drove home, I caught myself in the rearview mirror and saw what she meant. My face did look different, softer, somehow, like someone had erased years of careful control. Friday evening, Richard's client dinner ran late. I knew because he'd texted me at 8 o'clock, then again at 10, then midnight. By 1 a.m., I was sitting in my kitchen with a glass of wine, watching David's studio light burn bright through his windows. My phone buzzed. "Can't sleep either?" I looked toward David's house and saw him silhouetted in his studio window, looking back at me. "Apparently not," I texted back. "Want to talk about it?" Did I? I thought about Richard, probably charming clients over expensive scotch, completely unaware that his wife was falling apart in their perfect kitchen. I thought about the presentation he'd been preparing for weeks, how proud he'd be if it went well, how he wouldn't think to call and share the good news with me first. "Meet me in the garden," I typed before I could lose my nerve. The backyard felt different at night, mysterious and full of possibilities. David was already there when I slipped outside, sitting on the stone bench Richard had installed 2 summers ago but never used. The October air was crisp enough to make me pull my cardigan closer, but not cold enough to drive me back inside. "Couldn't sleep or wouldn't sleep?" he asked as I settled beside him. "Both, maybe. Richard's dinner is running late." "And you're worried about him?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications. Was I worried about Richard? Or was I relieved to have these stolen hours, this excuse to be exactly where I wanted to be? "I should be," I said finally. "But mostly I'm just tired of pretending." "Pretending what?" "That I'm happy. That my marriage is what I want it to be. That I don't think about you every minute of every day." The admission hung between us like a confession, and I immediately wanted to take it back. But David reached for my hand, intertwining our fingers, and the contact felt like coming home. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. "I want to be the kind of woman who knows the answer to that question." We sat in silence, holding hands like teenagers, until the sound of Richard's car in the driveway sent me scrambling back toward the house. I made it inside and upstairs before I heard his key in the lock, sliding into bed with my heart pounding and David's touch still burning on my skin. Richard climbed into bed 20 minutes later, smelling like wine and success. How did it go? I whispered. Better than expected. Morrison loved the proposal. We might get the contract. That's wonderful, I said, and meant it. Richard worked hard, deserved his successes. But as he settled into sleep beside me, I realized that his triumph felt separate from my life, like news from a distant country. Saturday morning, he left early to play golf with potential new clients, and I found myself getting dressed with more care than usual. Not for him, he was already gone, but for the possibility of seeing David, of stealing another few moments in the space between my real life and the life I was starting to want. But when I looked out the kitchen window, David's truck was gone, and his house looked empty. Disappointment hit me like a physical blow, followed by shame at how much his absence affected me. I spent the day cleaning obsessively, trying to distract myself from the growing certainty that I was losing my mind. This was exactly the kind of behavior that destroyed marriages, that turned respectable women into cautionary tales whispered about at neighborhood barbecues. But when David's truck pulled into his driveway at sunset, and I saw him carrying grocery bags and what looked like flowers, my heart lifted in spite of everything I told myself about being sensible. My phone buzzed. Dinner? I promise I'm a better cook than I look. I stared at the message for 10 minutes, thinking about all the reasons I should say no, all the ways this was spiraling beyond anything I could control. Then I thought about Richard, who would spend the evening reviewing client files and barely notice whether I was there or not. What time? I texted back. David's cooking was actually excellent, pasta with fresh vegetables from the farmer's market, bread he'd baked himself, wine that tasted like it cost more than our usual grocery budget. But it wasn't the food that made the evening feel dangerously intimate, it was the way he listened when I talked, really listened, as if my thoughts about books and art and the changing light in our neighborhood actually mattered. Tell me about the woman you used to be, he said over dessert, strawberries with cream that he'd whipped by hand. Before marriage, you mean? Before you decided that other people's expectations mattered more than your own happiness. I thought about that version of myself, the art history student who'd spent hours in museums, who'd traveled through Europe with nothing but a backpack and a sense of adventure. She felt like someone I'd read about rather than someone I'd been. She was brave, I said finally. Or maybe just naive. She thought she could have everything: career, love, art, travel. She hadn't learned yet that life requires choosing. Does it? Require choosing? Of course it does. You can't be a wife and mother and still chase dreams halfway around the world. You can't build security and take risks at the same time. Says who? The question stopped me cold. Says who? Richard, I supposed. His mother, with her careful advice about being practical. My own mother, who'd given up her teaching career to raise Margaret and me. Society, with its expectations about what wives should want and how they should behave. Says everyone, I said weakly. Everyone's wrong. After dinner, he showed me more of his work, paintings I hadn't seen before, sketches tucked into portfolios, photographs from his travels. His life looked like everything mine wasn't: messy, passionate, unplanned but somehow purposeful. I should go, I said around 10 o'clock, though I made no move toward the door. Should again, he said, echoing his words from the art gallery. What would you do if there was no should? I looked at him, really looked, and saw a man who seemed to exist without the careful boundaries that had defined my entire adult life. What would I do without should? I honestly didn't know anymore. I'd stay, I whispered. He kissed me then, soft and slow, and I felt something inside me crack wide open. This wasn't the desperate passion of our first encounters, but something deeper, more dangerous. This felt like the beginning of love, and that terrified me more than anything. When I finally left his house after midnight, Richard's car was in the driveway. I slipped in through the kitchen door, expecting to find him waiting, suspicious, ready for confrontation. Instead, I found a note on the counter, "Out late with Morrison. Don't wait up." He hadn't even known I was gone. I stood in my kitchen, still tasting David on my lips, still feeling his hands in my hair, and realized that my marriage had become so hollow that my husband didn't notice when I disappeared for an entire evening. The thought should have made me sad, but instead it made me angry at Richard for not seeing me, angry at myself for accepting so little for so long. When Richard came home an hour later, I was lying in bed pretending to sleep. He moved through his nighttime routine quietly, considerately, like a houseguest trying not to disturb his hosts. When he finally slipped into bed beside me, careful not to touch, I kept my breathing steady and my eyes closed. But I was wide awake, staring into the darkness, wondering how much longer I could live this double life before something had to break. The answer came sooner than I expected.